Overseas now to Europe's refugee crisis.
It's the biggest wave of refugees in modern history.
Hundreds of thousands have fled war and poverty in the Middle East and North Africa. They're pouring into Europe by sea and by a new land route from Turkey to Hungary.
There's been a significant rise just since the fall. And imagine how desperate you must be to put your kids in a rickety boat and send them out across these seas.
We've all heard about the refugee crisis. How dangerous the travel can be, how countries are refusing to let them in, and how politicians are nervous about incorporating everyone. But what you probably haven't heard much about is what really happens on the journey, and specifically, what happens to money. That's exactly what Kim Wilson and Roxani Cristalli set out to uncover in their study, The Financial Journey of Refugees.
The financial journey of refugees in the Mediterranean was about how refugees and migrants amass money before they depart, and then how do they access it along the way. And so in that we delved into different ways that people prepared for their journey. And a lot of that was about liquidating their savings, about accessing loans, and then of course they had to move with that money as they moved across different borders.
Wilson and Cristalli conducted field research throughout the Mediterranean, interviewing migrants and refugees on the move. The people they interviewed were frequently from Syria, traveling through Turkey, Greece, and then north into Europe. But they also interviewed people coming from Iran and Afghanistan, as well as East and West Africa. Questions about finances revealed important information about how refugees paid to travel to safety.
Some journeys are financed and some are simply funded. So what's the difference? Finance is when there's an element of debt involved, some kind of financial intermediation. Funded is simply when somebody goes around and can crowdfund their journey with their friends. They might liquidate their savings, they might sell animals. Some people inherited money, other people sold houses. But when you're financing a journey, you're looking at systems of debt and payment. And so we saw a lot of that, particularly from places like Afghanistan and East Africa. Most of the other journeys were not financed, they were simply funded, meaning people gathered in money as best they could prior to departure, simply amassing funds for their journey.
One image of refugees is that they pack up and flee in the middle of the night. But Wilson and Cristalli's research revealed that isn't always the case. Even refugees who fled after the onset of crisis usually had something in common about their finances.
They still, though, prepared for their departure. Many people knew they would eventually depart, even if it was sudden in the moment. Very few people we met had just left prior to thinking about it. So they had usually some funds to be able to bribe their way across different border points. So there was preparation, even if the flight was sudden.
There were many surprises revealed by this study. For example, Wilson and Cristalli learned that despite refugees using informal financial systems, these systems were surprisingly sophisticated.
So many of the systems that were informal were mirror images of more formal systems. So I'll give you an example. There's a system that they call the Saraf system, or the guarantee scheme. And that's where if you were in Afghanistan, you would find your smuggler, and you would also find a money agent or a Saraf. You would deposit your money, so let's say it was $7,500. You would deposit your money with the Saraf, and the Saraf would let the smuggler know that he'd received the full amount, and that would be the full fee. But the Saraf released the money to the smuggler only when the refugee or migrant reached a predetermined waypoint. The idea was that my journey, leg by leg, was guaranteed in the sense that my family back home knew I had made it thus far, and I wasn't paying for the whole trip and be completely vulnerable to the smuggler if they decided to leave me in the dust.
Refugees are fleeing crisis. Despite the existence of complex, informal financial systems, it isn't cheap to leave your home and travel to a new country in search of safety. As a result, humanitarian aid agencies frequently work to intercept refugees in order to assist them as they travel.
Humanitarian aid was critical. It was very, very important. The European Union granted large sums of monies to different NGOs and to different UN agencies, giving people funds so that they could rent an apartment, or they could buy food, or whatever it was that they needed. And the sums ranged depending on actually where their location was. So if you were in a camp, you might get more funds actually than somebody who was finding shelter, let's say in downtown Athens. But a family of 5 could expect to get something like 300 euros a month, which was nothing to scoff at.
However, humanitarian aid proved to be complicated. The agencies that distribute it apply rules for legal and logistical reasons. As a result, this aid prioritized certain types of services and certain types of refugees over others. Wilson and Cristalli's research showed that single men were often deemed as threats and thus denied aid. This research examines the complicated relationships between crisis, assistance, agency, and dignity. It investigates what money and financial transactions can tell us about the refugee experience. To learn more about the research of Wilson, Cristalli, and the financial journey of refugees, visit the Institute for Human Security at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University.